Dear students, in this session we would talk about the segregation between the nobilities in the Middle English period, especially in the later half of the Middle English period, and French reinforcement. I expect that by completing this topic, you will be able to understand how the segregation of French and English elitism took place and what was its impact. Well, one of the consequences of all that was going on in terms of loss of Normandy towards the mid of this Middle English period, there was a serious question. It brought to a head the question of whether many of the nobility owed their alliance to England or to France. So, it is very natural for a ruler to know or to understand how many of the people think they belong to him or how many of them think they belong to another land. After the Norman conquest, a large number of people held lands in both the countries. So, in fact, all the aristocracy in England, these aristocratic people, they had their properties and they had their lands and they had their possessions, both in England and in France. A kind of interlocking aristocracy existed, so that it might be difficult for some of the English nobility actually for themselves to decide whether in reality they belonged to England or to the continent. Some steps towards the separation of their interests had been taken from time to time. So, for example, I would say on several occasions, Henry I confiscated the English estates of unruly Norman barons. The Norman barons who did not behave well, their lands were captured, they were confiscated. However, it was in the year 1204 that the process of separation was greatly accelerated. It was accelerated because a decree that was from 1204 to 1205 of the King of France announced that he had confiscated the lands of several of these barons. Naturally, the reaction had to happen. For the most part, the families that had estates on both the sides of the channel, now they were compelled to give up one of the the lands, either the lands that they had in the continent or in England. Sometimes they divided into branches and made separate terms. Sometimes great nobles preferred their larger holdings in England and gave up their Norman lands. Now people decided, these matters as per their choices and preferences. Some of people would do what is that they would divide the lands and the properties on both of the sides into their family. So, one son would have property here, the other would have in the other land. One son would have some possessions in this part, the other would have in the other part of the world. Sometimes these nobles, they preferred where they would have more land, more property, more possessions, they would announce that they belong to that. So in that case, many of these Norman conquerors, they announced their loyalties to England, and thus they gave up their French possessions. During all this series of happenings, an incident happened in 1244, which sped up this whole process. I'm going to quote something from what happened. This was actually an address of the King of France. Led by the circumstances, he said, and I quote, "As it is impossible that any man living in my kingdom and having possessions in England can completely serve two masters, he must either inseparably attach himself to me or to the King of England." So, the King of France clearly announced that the nobility has to decide whether they would like to belong to England or to France. So, the result was that people had to relinquish their properties either in England or in France. They had to give up the possessions out of the French ones and the ones that they had in England. Now, knowing this, the king ordered that all the people of French nation, and especially the Normans who had possessions in England, should be disseised of them. So it was after 1250 that there was no reason for the nobility of England to consider itself anything but English. Now, those who opted to be affiliated with or to be identified with England, whether they were the natives or the Norman conquerors who had opted for England, there was no other choice for them but to be identified with the English and England. And the most valid reason for its use of French as a result was gone. Now that they had made a conscious choice of England, of course, the original language of England, English, was supposed to be used. French lost its importance or significance. Now comes the question, how should be the reinforcement of French? This is when the country experienced a fresh invasion. All this has happened. This separation has taken place, this segregation has taken place, and suddenly something new happens. And what is that? This is a fresh invasion of foreigners, this time mostly from the south of France. This was the time of invasion where, Henry III's long reign, 1216 to 1272, was eaten up by strangers. Even London was full to overflowing not only of people of different nationalities, of different origins, like Patavans, Romans, Provençals, but also of Spaniards who did great injury to English, because these all people brought their own influences. Thus, the reinforcement of French language once again took place.